I was watching. Anything exciting?
No, retirement.
Yeah, I did.
We met years ago, Clemson, Town and Gannon, they all came down in a big bus. So Auburn, City of Auburn, campus met, we met for a whole day. So
Oh, I see. So that's
we
how you-
paired off, the police paired off, and, you know, the fire people paired off, and the campus people paired off. It was a really constructive thing. They were so impressed with the camaraderie between towns, that they were struggling.
I see.
They were in the same box,
I
but
see. Right.
but we've always had pretty good relations, so.
Oh, wow, that's a nice ride.
Hey man, how are you?
I know, so I just tell you. I didn't even understand that.
We'll try to break it down. You see the date and time period, that was the original. Second order. This is totals. The top of the pro.
Well, it's tough.
Thank you very much. Okay, I appreciate that.
Hey.
See you. How you doing?
Good.
First about feedback.
Great argument.
Hello, man. How are you doing? So this one is coming up like that.
Sorry, I didn't know.
Just came back. Some great data. Called us off guard. Got him. I don't know if you just had it so quick.
Somebody told me a year ago, so he wasn't doing well, but I didn't know what it was.
Okay, so as you can see in the dates on here, this was diagnosed as an awful. To be honest with you, spinal. People say they got cancer, their spinal cord is bad.
Right.
Extremely scientific statistics, but at least it gives you a feel of, you can go, you can then research the data.
I kind of did the same thing.
Yeah.
Color coding and highlighting, but
It's
it's
not,
not
it's,
scientific.
it's not a one shoe fits all, because everybody's not completely aware of all the nuances, but it kind of gives you an idea of more of a holistic idea. I'm glad you're on the team, that's all.
Yeah, I know. We're in the park.
Oh, I parked over.
Okay, me too. I get told everything, okay.
Yeah, I know that was it.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Hey, Megan.
Hey, good, how are y'all?
Yes, ma'am. Oh, okay.
Yes, hi. Hey, well, no, okay, good to meet you. And I saw your emails.
These are.
Oh, really? Okay. Okay. Yeah, that was a while ago. That's right. Sure did. Good to see you, sir.
All right.
How are you?
Good.
Very nice to meet you.
Hey, Evan. Good to meet you.
Megan, this is Evan Crawford.
Yeah, we know. We know it's, oh, how are you? Good to see you. Sit wherever you will. Then Brett tells you it's good to see you.
Where- So we do total comments.
You all right?
Yes.
79.
I've seen your stuff.
Oh, okay.
Not four, it was 59. No, really? That's what it was anyway.
Huh?
Yeah. That's what, I mean, that's what we've been doing.
Hey, Anna. Hey, how are you? Good, how about you? Doing great.
These are broken out.
Oh, I enjoyed that very much. It was very nice. It was a nice event. I like the fact.
That's
that
what,
you were-
that's why this is,
We're looking at
yeah,
all
yeah,
things,
yeah.
right?
This is, these were very nice. This was the fun.
Because you guys are spread throughout the state, people don't necessarily always realize what goes into it, and it's good to see. Top to bottom, you have faculty, staff, spread everywhere, the students are everywhere.
Airbnb or some sort of. That doesn't mean that they have to.
Okay, okay, I got you now.
Yeah, because there were some individuals.
See, one of my big takeaways, I think, I have a big difference between accepting homesteaders.
You think?
And that's, you're seeing that.
Okay, let's go get started. Certainly appreciate everybody being here, and welcome to all these bright, shiny new faces we got sitting with us, and we look forward to working with you. Just kind of look back as where we are and how we got here. The city has had a drafted ordinance for a while now. It was difficult to govern, and really the city's role in previous years has been to govern short-term housing by complaints. And so when there were complaints about noise, cars, such as that, the city reacted to those complaints and really sought to curtail the activity from a nuisance standpoint. It was my intuition through the election that this was something that was not gonna go away, and that the city needed to have a policy that we could live with, that we could govern with, that was fair to our community, that they understood that this is what Auburn's position is in short-term housing. And so we formed this task force, which was initially 5 people here, and we've recently added 3 folks in the community, and certainly welcome to have you guys here. We took our original draft ordinance and put that out for public consumption and had a public hearing. Another ordinance was drafted. I would say the first one was restrictive, the second one was more permissive. And we have gotten public comment on that. And on the 22nd of this month, we'll have another public hearing. Okay? So when that public hearing is done, what we should have at our disposal for consideration is 2 different public hearings, 2 different drafts of an ordinance, 2 different sets of public commentary, okay? And that hopefully will give us something that we can begin developing some ideas that we eventually will hand off to the planning commission for them to begin to put together, an ordinance for the city to consider in the future. So, for those of y'all that are new, you've got a little bit of catch up to do, but I think we can rally some of that information to your disposal here sooner than later. The meeting on the 22nd is important, and I know that you can't be there, but I hope everybody else will be there. I would just like to encourage everyone that your position between now and then is one of a listener and not one of advocacy. To me, I think our role should, as leadership in this task force, should be one that we really want to hear what the community's got to say about this. Eventually, all of us will have to put our cards on the table. We'll have no choice but to do that, whether we're in the planning commission or whether we're in the city council. And then those of you that have been asked to join, you'll certainly have your time to share what you think is in Auburn's best interest moving forward. But until we get through this public hearing, I would ask that you're all very considerate of the fact that we need to listen and listen well. And we should try to motivate those citizens which are gonna come on the 22nd and share their concerns, feelings, promotions, or whatever they wanna do, because they have the rights of citizens to do that. And so just be cognizant of that over the next week and a half as we move towards the 22nd. And there'll be a time for you to all just put it right out there where the goats can eat it, as Bob Norman used to say, that you can share how you feel we should go forward. So that's where we are. That's where we stand here today. And today is really just a time to kind of catch you guys up, answer any questions, and to make sure we're all tracking in the same direction as far as our process, okay? What we'll do after the 22nd is we'll set a date and we'll come back together and have another work session. And at that work session, we'll begin to deliberate amongst ourselves, what are the things that we feel like this ordinance should have in it? What are the things we ought to allow? What are the things we ought to restrict? How do we feel about it? And where should we go? And we've got to get to a point amongst this task force where we can hand something off to the planning commission for them to consider, because that's how it works. The planning commission will get first shot at it, they'll look at it, they'll discuss it, debate it, deliberate it, vote on it, and then they'll hand it off to the city council for consideration. None of this happens fast. There's advertising requirements on all these kind of things, and so it is not something that will get on a fast track and happen, but we'll be as efficient as possible, because I feel like it's important for our community for us not to belabor the point. This is a difficult decision. There's an impassioned interest in this, and so there'll be a lot of eyes on each of you. And I hope you understand that going into it, that you've signed up for something that'll create some real interest and dynamic in our community. So I appreciate you being willing to be here. So that's I just want to set the tone for kind of where we are, where we've been, and where we're going. Does anybody have any questions about that? Okay.
If the meeting next week, will that be recorded?
Yes.
So that I can watch it?
Yes. Yes, and I should have added, you should have 2 videos of 2 public hearings that you can consider too. So, I'm not overly fast learning. It might take me a little while after the 22nd to consume all this information before I'm ready to come and talk about it. And so we'll just have to talk amongst ourselves, when do we need to set that next meeting? And I would expect it to take us a little bit to kind of be able to come up with some things that we got some type of consensus or strong feelings about before we hand off to the planning commission. And I want us to be efficient, but I don't want us to be reckless with our time, and I want us to be thorough. Of course, one question I had for you, though, like if you communicate, what kind of format of information would you and the planning commission expect this task force to put together? Is it a narrative? Is it bullet points? I know we're not writing an ordinance for you, but
I think it would just be a task force report. Probably less is more. I think what Ron's introduced to you is exactly right. We started out with something that was quite conservative and fairly restrictive. We got some fairly strong response that it was too much, too conservative, too restrictive. So we opened it up. We added some additional opportunities for rentals. I think the short-term non-primary rentals of primary use was probably the big item. We went out there and recommended some things. For example, that you could have this short-term non-primary rental overlay in some areas that actually are some of our most restrictive zones. including NC, and I think you've gotten some comments back in the latest round of comments from folks who kind of weighed in on that NC issue. The overlay map, I think all of you've seen. There's no real magic to where those lines are drawn, other than just staff's own familiarity with the neighborhoods and areas that we know that there's already some of this type of activity, or areas that would certainly be desirable for this type of activity. So what I've always tried to explain to folks is that I'm really just your scribe. What I've provided you is not based on my personal opinions or preferences. It's based on benchmarking and following the lead of the task force and the community sentiment that we've gotten to date, and then responding to that. So I've had to kind of convey that on numerous occasions, but whatever that's worth.
Well, if we were looking for reaction, we got it.
Yeah, we did get, yeah, no, we definitely got some reaction, we'll get more.
Yeah.
Certainly next week.
No, I'm wondering about the public access. We spoke briefly, you and I and Brett, at one point about getting public access to the commentary that's already been submitted, the redacted copy. And I wonder if that's something that we would agree on would be a good gesture towards the interested parties now, that on our website, on the city website.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Bob. So Bob and Brett and I did talk about this last week. Our thought was to have this meeting today before we decided what to do about that. And so the question before you, and I think we're all comfortable, is the names are redacted, so the public commentary is available. We'll take everybody's names off there. But is everybody good with the task force be okay with the city putting that out? And Forrest, can you see any problems with doing that?
It's fine with me.
Okay.
I would say. I
Mr.
think
Buster in the back, are we okay doing that?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I think there are a couple addresses that may still be in there.
Okay.
I need to look over just to make sure that there aren't any names or addresses.
Yeah. I mean, we skimmed it pretty well, I believe, didn't we, as far as trying to get all the personal information off of there.
Yeah, I've reviewed it. I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to the redacted elements, but so I'm probably not a good person to ask. I was just reading for substance.
So are we talking about putting the addresses, make them available to the public?
We don't want
No, what
personal
I-
information available.
No, what I was saying is that there were some addresses that were.
She just asked us to make double sure that we don't,
Okay,
something doesn't
because
accidentally get in there.
by being redacted, the topic of redaction creates some problems in terms of correlating the statistics. Because the first, you can't combine the first set of commentaries and the second and formulate a cohesive statistical analysis, because you don't know to what extent there are duplications between the two documents, so that has to be discounted. Plus, also within each of the surveys, you cannot ascertain whether or not there's duplication. I found one obvious duplication, and that was between comment number 104 and 106. But you cannot tell any differences between any other. And I bring that up.
You mean duplication, you mean for the consideration that the same person answered the same question
correct.
twice?
The reason I bring that up is because I know we got Brett's results. I want to pass this out to all the members. And you'll see that there are substantial differences in the results. And I went and I documented, I summarized each of the base document from which I drew my summary. And so if anyone wants to look at that, I would be happy to meet with Brett and a third party so we can reconcile our differences, because there are substantial differences between the two. I, for example, found that in terms of homestays, two out of a sample of 47, which is not a statistically significant sample, there are 64% were in favor of homestays and 36 opposed. On the other hand, in terms of the STRs, and then the problem is a number of individuals comment on non-primary and other individuals comment on gave STR, so that they combined short-term rental, non-primary and homestays together and lumped them together. I could not separate those two because there was no rationale by which I could separate them. So what I have is support, for example, support STR generally. Now generally, there are a lot of caveats associated with those. For example, people were concerned about externalities, noise, noise pollution, parking issues, and so on. So there's some things that you cannot separate or correlate together. And so our two results are substantially different.
Well, and I'll tell you, and add to that, the good point is that the data's there, because everybody will read the comments.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's a good thing. It's not, we're not talking polling and statistics, it's just kind of a key as someone that wants to dig into dig in, because you'll be able to see. I think Bruno brought up 2 points, so the first point, I think we're all in agreement. I would recommend that we lean towards redacting, for safety purposes, as this is met in particular neighborhoods. I would not want to get into, I guess we could look at it from, I don't know that, it's just public commentary, but I think.
Sorry about that.
If we're giving out names and addresses.
No, we don't want to do that.
I think that'd be probably.
We don't want to do that. Is everybody okay with putting the comments on there, the protection of the people's, okay?
I think anybody can dig into it, they can dig in themselves if they want to read.
Absolutely.
What the public is on the issue.
Thank you, Bob, for bringing that up. So we'll move ahead, and I'll get with the city manager tomorrow, and we'll get moving on that. Okay.
In my comment, I think there's just a couple places that
Sure. No,
we just need to
we
read through. I
don't
think
get
I
any
saw.
accidents, so
Yeah.
you're right. Thank you so much, Anna. Brett, did you want to say anything? I haven't asked you if you'd like to make a comment for.
Well, no, I'm excited for, did you want to do an introduction with our newest members?
Absolutely, we can.
Okay.
Why don't you make your comments and we'll do that?
Yeah, that's great. I just want to thank Forrest for all the work that he's put into this so far. I know that your staff has done a substantial amount of work. I think the task force would pride themselves in the amount of transparency we've had through this whole process. This being our third or fourth public hearing. Third or fourth, one, and so at the end of the day, I think we're gonna be able to have a substantial record to produce to planning commission. And I wanted to be clear too for our new members, what we're putting together is not a final product, right? Is that right, Mayor?
That's exactly right. That's what I was clarifying with Forrest.
Is that we wanna get kind of the temperature of the community and then run it through its paces, because even in addition to our additional 2 more hearings, we're gonna have, I guess planning would have a hearing, or at least one, and then we'll again at city council level have another hearing.
Yeah,
Which-
We'll at least have a single, if not more than one work session with them before we'll even schedule it for public hearing.
And it would, we could produce a product and tell planning to head, up or down vote on this, they're gonna have some feedback or do their.
So the point you're making, at the end of the day, this will have had at least 4 public hearings, which is important. Brett made a great point, and I apologize I didn't do that earlier. So we've got 3 new people here, and I'll start with you. We're gonna just give us a 1-minute commercial about who you are and why you're here.
My name is Bruno Ulrich, and the reason I'm here is I have a twofold background. One, as former planning director, Columbus, Georgia, years ago, and most currently the last 35 years in commercial and light industrial retail development. As some of you know, that Tiger Town was one of the projects that I oversaw all of the design and construction. So I'm interested in blending development and planning experiences together.
Sorry I jumped in there, I thought you were done. And Mr. Councilman Parsons asked you to join us, so thank you. Anna?
John. Guess I'm on the task force because I had sent the previous city council, emails about short-term rentals. And interest on several fronts. One is that I live in, I think, a very desirable neighborhood, very close to Amsterdam's and very close to campus. So I'm in an NC area, but my husband and I travel a lot, and we like a lot of different experiences, and so sometimes we like hotels, and sometimes we like short-term rentals or Airbnb. We're going in a few weeks to an Airbnb, so travel a lot, and we have had short-term rental property too. We don't have any here in Auburn right now, but we have had it previously, but we do have something at the beach, so.
Thank you. And Anna's not designated for this, so thank you, appreciate it. Evan?
Evan Crawford, and I have the joy of knowing Brett here, and he's, for better or worse, kind of picked my brain on it a couple times, just being locally in real estate here for a couple of years now, and, you know, having a lot of people buying and selling properties and asking about short-term rentals and kind of their feedback that I've heard. And Brett's kind of picked my brain on that aspect of it, so, aspect of this, so, definitely.
Good to help, man. Glad you're here. Okay. Forrest, what pieces of information can we provide, the members of this task force that maybe they don't have right now? Is there anything we're missing?
I mean, I can pull together just some email traffic, just some summaries when there have been revisions made, kind of what the background for those were and kind of what the framework is. So, to make a long story short, we now have what's recommended to be a kind of a 3-tiered system of short-term rental. So we've got the homestay, which is a home occupation option, which would just be a home occupation issuance inspection and then reviewed by the city in terms of you coming in with the required documents to have that be allowed. So it would not be a primary or principal use. And so essentially you could do it anywhere in the city. So the zoning districts that have the restricted family definition, you're limited 60 days per calendar year. And zoning districts where you have up to 5 unrelated is allowed, you would have up to 120 days a year per calendar year. And then kind of the highest threshold or the most generous threshold, albeit it would require approvals, you know, in most cases by the planning commission and the city council, would be the basically the short-term rental overlay area, which includes a number of zones, most of which are along or close to the university or along Opelika Road. I don't know if we have the ability, we have a laptop here if we wanted to project anything.
We can.
I mean, if y'all want to take a look at the map or.
If I may interject, I've got a copy of the color maps that were issued.
We can bring this up just for the audience, too, just so they can follow along.
You want to lower yours? You brought
You want to keep passing those around?
So, the short-term non-primary rental, STNPR, it would be regulated as a primary use. The principal use of the unit would be for rental purposes. So that's where the 240 days comes in, because if you're renting for 240 days, that's a majority of the year, hence that's the primary use of the property. Now, under the initial version, the more restrictive version, we were just looking at homestays, and under the original version, NC wasn't even an option. So if you had an NC zone property, there was no type of short-term rental activity proposed to be allowed. Based on the responses we got and the desire to open it up a little bit and make it more permissive, we essentially included all the zones, and then we topped it off with the short-term rental overlay. Essentially, the first several slides are just walking you through the draft that you have, and then I think the last slide is the actual map.
Does everybody have a copy of the original draft, the first one? If not, do you have access to get that? Should.
So this is just these are the lines that were drawn on the map. You can see essentially where you can have short-term rental by right. It would largely be in the urban neighborhoods and urban core, and the corridor redevelopment districts that run along Opelika Road. Those were the zones that were created as part of the new Opelika Road plan. Bear in mind that, and you're starting to see it bear itself out, that with the new zoning along Opelika Road, we allow residential where previously you could not establish residential uses. But it's still primarily a commercial corridor, and therefore we didn't feel that there would be much in the way of compatibility issues with these types of uses along Opelika Road, and based on the density and the urban neighborhoods and all the student housing and the mix of housing. The same goes for the downtown and the urban neighborhoods, plus highly desirable rental areas. And then really, we just kind of took a look at the areas in close environs. Some of the RDD zone property up on North Gay, where we're getting a lot of student housing redevelopment. Obviously, I think the most comments we've received have been on the south side, where you've got several different NC zones that are included, and some of our core prized neighborhoods, I guess I would call them, down in the Sanford Gay area and south. And again, no magic to where these lines were drawn. It was just based on kind of my own geographical knowledge of the area. What I was telling somebody, they emailed me something today about why they own two properties that were part of the Glendine area, and those properties were split zoning. I said, well, you got to draw the line somewhere. And so it's really nothing more than that. So I just cannot emphasize more that is a draft, and those lines are very much up for debate and discussion and adjustment. So that's essentially it.
Any questions from Forrest?
Yes, the green, it says by right,
Yes, sir.
but on the yellow, it says non-primary rental. And if I understand correctly, one of your staff said the word conditional would apply to the yellow area.
That's right.
So that the conditional probably should be added at the end of overlay, just to make sure everybody understands.
Yeah, and that's reflected in the draft, and certainly we can do that. That was just for illustrative purposes, but essentially what we've done is clarified that in the actual permitted use table, so you'll see that it'll be conditional use approval required. For example, we've got property in those cross-hatched areas that are zoned NC, DDH, NRD, and RDD. And so I didn't actually put the zoning layer on there, but that's just to let you know that there are multiple zoning districts, some of which have the more restrictive family definition applied for occupancy purposes, that are currently proposed to at least be eligible to have a short-term non-primary rental.
And if I may follow up on the question.
Sure.
My understanding is that in the entire map, while it does not say so, does allow for homestays.
Yes.
So all of Auburn would come under the homestay regulations.
Yes.
As in okay.
In a follow-up on that would be based on the zoning, like you were mentioning a moment ago. Of course, there'd be a limitation on the calendar, the time within the calendar throughout the city.
That is also true.
And right now, it's not unlimited. It's specific periods based on the zone.
That is accurate.
And your HOA would ultimately rule the day on this too, correct?
Yeah, the city does enforce. I've worked in places where the city actually did enforce deed restrictions and covenants, but the city does not. We don't have copies of them. We don't review them. We don't enforce them. Okay. Anything that's in violation of those would simply be a civil matter between the HOA and the property owner. The city would have absolutely no involvement with that.
So we could support or pass an ordinance that was permissive, but ultimately individual HOAs, neighborhoods could be more restrictive. Would that be a fair statement?
Presumably. Now keep in mind that most of the older neighborhoods, those deeds, restrictions, and covenants, they run for about 20 years and then they go away and they disappear. So most of these neighborhoods are highly likely not to have any protective restrictions or covenants in place. So I just want to make sure that's made known that you're not necessarily gonna be able to fall back on deed restrictions and covenants in a lot of areas to help you out with this, for that very reason.
If I may, ask a question or follow up on a comment. I know that a number of the people who responded on the survey were concerned about the homestays being in their neighborhood and more specifically in the NC zone.
Yes, sir.
Now, under the non-primary, where it's listed as a conditional use, that has to go through the recommendations have to be prepared by the planning staff, ultimately goes to the planning commission for review, and then to the city council for roughly a 60+ day process.
That's accurate.
Under the homestay, the only requirement, once you make a submittal, is for the planning staff to review and approve all within 3 days. If I understand the regulations correctly, under the home occupation ordinance, provisions of the zoning ordinance, it requires the planning staff to review and approve within 3 days, unless you've got additional questions to ask.
That's accurate.
Yeah, it's a good question about why the difference, and I'm sure there's a good reason, but why the difference between having homestays and short-term rentals? Like, and why not just have one set of rules?
Well, the thinking was that it didn't make a lot of sense to me to have these zones that are essentially restricted by the family definition. I mean, this is by changing the number of days, you know, a lot of that has to do with primary use versus secondary and ancillary use. So the experience you're gonna have as a neighbor next to someone who has the opportunity to rent it for 60 days is gonna be considerably different than 240. So it made a lot of sense to me that you would have a tiered approach, if you will, to
And Forrest, wasn't that
give people
also,
different opportunities and options.
wasn't that based on feedback from the first round of public hearings in terms of?
Well, it was that too, sure. Yeah, I mean, and again, before the first version, it never crossed my mind to recommend that these be allowed at all in NC personally, quite frankly. And that's why the initial draft didn't reflect any of that, because the initial draft was simply me with my planner brain and there having been no public input.
Yeah, a lot of public input though, stating from property owners, I purchased a house and this is what I do to make my mortgage payment. And there were a number of comments at Frank Brown Rec Center that evening that addressed that. So one of the comments to staff was, can you look at this and please consider an adjustment to address that issue, and that is also in response to that.
Can we pivot here to, not pivot, but segue to complaints? I want to talk, I know that's one of the things, is noise, trash, and traffic. What have we got in place right now in the new, I mean, I think it's been the same. Can you kind of go over what we're doing?
Yeah, it's basically potentially a 3 strikes and you're out type deal as far as having your zoning certificate revoked. And the most complaints you're gonna get are gonna be noise, and what typically happens is, and this doesn't happen very often, but we have had cases in the past that we've had to come after for zoning enforcement and go to court, and on very rare occasion, circuit court. But the general rule of thumb with public safety and the police department specifically is that they get a noise complaint, it's typically gonna be of the loud music variety. They'll go out, they'll determine if they think, number one, is the noise truly unreasonable, and if they say yes, they ask them to turn it down. If they come back, then it gets documented. And so that would likely be the most prevalent type of complaint we would get. And then we would essentially notify the property owner once it's been determined that there's a substantiated complaint, and put them on notice about it. So they also have a way of knowing, are they on strike 2, strike 1, or are they getting ready to get out of the game, kind of thing.
So if they're done, what happens if they strike out?
They get their license revoked. Specifically, shall not be eligible to receive any new zoning certificate for a rental for the remaining portion of the calendar year in which the certificate is revoked, and for the entire succeeding year. So you It's like being put in timeout.
So it could be problematic for someone that then, if they wanted to try to reapply in a conditional use.
That's the intent, you always hit people in the pocketbook, and that would hopefully serve as a deterrent. If they decide they even wanna get back in the game.
They still have the option of renting long-term though, would they not?
Depends on where they're located.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
The
Well,
only,
no, even if I'm even if I live in NC, I could still rent long-term to a family.
Oh, yes. Yeah, you're talking like in a lease.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah, that's, yeah.
Really,
Then you're not
short-term.
this.
Yeah.
Right,
That's the-
understood.
And that's the
I wasn't sure where you were heading with
That's
that.
the 180-day threshold, right? I mean, anything else?
Yeah, that is part of the ordinance, is to essentially define what constitutes a permanent residence. And a lot of that has to do with kind of getting between the primary and secondary use type thing.
the only thing about the enforcement aspect of it is it says three substantiated complaints in a year. So let's hypothetically say you have 2 in November, and then you don't have another one until the new year. By going from calendar year, you could easily flip it on over to the next year and repeat the whole process without having any any revocation of the permit. Whereas if you convert it into 365 days, then it would make it be more punitive for violators. And it'd be good to see the 365 days rather than the calendar year.
That's fine.
That's something we can recommend, there's
You
no
know,
question.
But what, I know enforcement comes up quite a bit, and enforcement's usually always the toughest aspect of zoning to a large extent. But the benefit that we will have in this case is the city's, I can't remember, Penny can correct me. We have an additional tool in our toolbox with this that we haven't had in the past, which I think, because this is this is a big deal as far as what you're talking about happening and what we're talking about transitioning to and regulating. So there's a considerable amount of work involved, particularly on the front end in terms of getting all these things reviewed, permitted appropriately, licensed, and then, the continual monitoring and enforcement aspect. Having said
We
that,
gotta think about as we develop,
having said that, I think this is my professional opinion. I think you got to do this. You got to get regulations in place. I think the current situation is somewhat untenable, and it's I don't think we're at the volume where I don't think the answer is that we just kind of let it go laissez-faire. I think there needs to be a framework, because we hear from a lot of people. The biggest complainer I have, she's all about short-term rentals, but she feels like with the current situation, it's not a level playing field. In terms of, she would submit to you, and I'm sure she's right, that some people play by the rules and some people don't. Some people are paying the appropriate taxes and some people aren't. And so the people that aren't playing by the rules are inherently at a competitive advantage over those that are, and you don't want to have that kind of situation.
Would there be any strike rule on like a neighbor that's just constantly calling on someone that there was
Yeah, we would have to weed that out. That would certainly not be deemed to be a
Like a neighbor that's
substantiated
just-
complaint if you've got if you're like in a Hatfields and McCoy.
Right.
Yeah, at the National Planning Conference, I sat through 12 hours of sessions about short-term rentals. I spent most of my time there, and one of the interesting notions was one neighbor complained 750 times in a month through a third-party service, but never submitted a video, a picture, or an audio recording of any situation, and that's kind of part of the deal. If you're having issues, we need documentation, and that is where the city sifted through and said, "I'd love to help you, but you've got to help us help you." And there is some reasonableness in that, and those are the things. Everybody's got a cell phone, and if there's that big of an issue, there are ways to address it.
Sure.
But enforcement is the #1 nightmare of every municipality in the country, and most of the notion at that conference was, we need to regulate this, people are going to do it. Like, we've got to figure out a way to deal with it, because they're going to do it, whether we make it lawful or not, so how do we muddle through the things, and that's what you guys are struggling with now.
Megan,
but-
did you uncover some things that people were doing that we haven't thought of that can be helpful to us as we move ahead trying to?
No, I mean, the number one thing is don't create an ordinance that you can't enforce. That was the number one underlying theme, and from both short-term rental companies, legal counsel, regional governments, local governments, is create something that's reasonable to enforce, because a lot of people went out of the gate with regulations that they overdid it and they couldn't manage them and they couldn't regulate it, and ended up with something that was a little more simplified. The complaints are the big challenge, enforcement, and then dealing with complaints. Most people have something similar to what we're looking at, and Forrest has done a lot of research and others have, but you know, not being enforceable is the number one issue cities are facing, and what will happen in court with how, if you go too far with your regulations and your ability to enforce them is diminished. And this was state to state. This was Midwest to the coast, the north and south, so it kind of helped that you had people from all over the country sitting there. It is an affordable housing issue for some. By and large, the city of West Hollywood is 2 square miles, and they regulate it differently because they've got affordable housing issues in their very small city. And there are other people that, you know, are pretty broad about it, and all vacation destinations are not bothered by this at all. You know, you get anywhere that's a big ski destination or a beach destination, they've been dealing with it for years in a very different format, so to them, what's the big deal? So, you know, that's the other thing I learned. But enforcement, there are ways to deal with it depending on, you know, what your things are. I certainly don't advocate that city staff members are out 24 hours a day dealing with it. If we can get some help from adjoining property owners that are aggrieved by evidence, you know, on their cell phones or however they can do it, provide to us that there are issues, those are the easier ways. And across the board, everybody said if neighbors provide evidence, and it's not neighbors that are out to get, they're truly being aggrieved by what's going on, that is how cities dealt with it the best, because then in court, back to the legal side, or somebody wants to fight about the strikes that they had, and then there's documents as to why these were issues, and they have time and date stamp, so.
If I may follow up with some comments you had. I did a national search, research by about a dozen communities across the country, and you were bringing up some of the issues that they recognize as a common thread for all those communities, and allow me to pass that around. Those are the issues that I think most people are looking at, and I thought that perhaps, you know, some of the things that we may also want to focus on.
And we had done, I think Forrest can go into, he had done a lot of research before we ever started this process, so when he drafted the first set of regulations, we were pretty clear from the research he and his staff had done as to where this stood in terms of nationwide and benchmarking a number of college towns that are similar, because they're dealing with the same thing. So we had a good idea when he drafted the first set where this stood.
Now, we're looking at a map with a bunch of dots on it. I'm guessing you probably almost 200 dots on there. And this represents homes in the area from the research we've done that are participating currently?
Well, yeah, that was the company that we're contracting with did basically some courtesy scanning for us, basically to let us know based on their data what was out there. And the different colors mean different things as far as what exact type of short-term rental activity is going on there.
And I really asked that question, and I know it's not just in one isolated area, it's all over the city limits. Do you have an idea of who's gonna wanna participate, not necessarily as renters or people, but homeowners or landowners that are gonna wanna participate? Is it gonna be mom and pops? Is it, is it developers? Is it people who are gonna buy a neighborhood? I mean, do you have any idea?
We probably know at least one example of about every kind of manifestation you can imagine. You got a lot of people that like to go out of town on a game day weekend. I know someone myself who's a friend of the family that she'll take off for 4 days over at her house, and she gets $3,000-4,000. So she's paying her mortgage and then some just by going out of town and enjoying herself for the weekend. So, you know, and that's one reason why the second version, the other thing it does is it backs off of the owner occupied for the homestay. The residence does not have to be owner occupied during the period. rental activity, whether it's a 60 or 120 days, that was another adjustment that was made to make things more permissive, for example. But like I said, that's all up for discussion, and, however, y'all decide you want to kind of craft it or troubleshoot or what have you, I'd be happy to do that.
If I could follow on from there, Forrest. Could you provide us with the name of the monitoring company that we contracted with?
It's called Short-Term Rental Helper.
It's actually.
Is that right, Penny?
Yeah, they actually got bought out by Host Compliance.
Oh, Host Compliance.
And so they are Host Compliance, and you can look them up.
And I
But,
presume-
we should be receiving, we've submitted our data to them, and, we should be receiving some preliminary numbers here really soon, like we expect them kind of any day. And then they'll train us on getting into their database, and we'll be able to see updates through, by logging onto their database, and we can see we'll get an initial swipe through the city, and then we'll be able to see as places are added, because what they do is scan, they go out and look at all the websites, the Airbnbs and VRBOs, and look for addresses and stuff, and match, they do data point matches in the city.
And most cities use them, meaning this is a theme also, is most everyone has a third party, and this is the main one that they use.
So, Penny, to date, we've only received the map so far as.
That was literally some preliminary, they did, when they came to us and we were looking at different entities, they said this is preliminary of what we could do. Just a quick swipe, and so we haven't really received any good data. Okay.
When we talk say about enforcement, a number of people have brought the notion that it would be good to have STR Helper provide the city the web-based, online, available to the public, locations of all the homestays or non-primary or investment properties, so that when there's an issue that arises regarding enforcement, the neighbors, the citizens could go to the map, just like they do now with WebGIS, go to the map and know for sure whether or not that is a legitimate business or not a legitimate business, and if they can, if they can report the violation and the address. So it would be a great service to the public if that could be put online for self-enforcement by the citizens.
Do we have a database that shows rental properties in town?
Not in public.
Yeah.
And we don't map business licenses either, do we, Penny?
I'm sorry,
No.
we don't want.
We don't map business licenses, Jim,
No.
either.
But
Meaning people can request the information, but it's not something that is just clicking.
Can we talk about economic impact? What is the revenue stream for the city? Is the business license, I think there's a couple sources, right?
Lodging tax.
Lodging tax.
The lodging tax, there's a business license component to this, and Latrice can actually speak, I'm gonna let, there's a business license component to this if you're going to do business as a short-term rental, and that is a primary business, you will need a business license. But the actual taxes and the bulk of the money that comes into the business is the 13%, that is our lodging taxes, 7 of which comes directly to the city, and one of that goes to our, goes to the tourism bureau. So that is the bulk of that particular, the numbers that come from the city as far as the tax.
How about the hotel industry? I know that this may be similar to competition. I know there's been a couple statements about hotel industry not being at capacity. Is there truth to that?
I mean, that depends. Everybody, there's been a notion of market studies, and, there are different types of hotels, there are different desires. Some people prefer hotels, some prefer short-term rentals. Occupancy on football weekends and I don't mean, you think everybody's at 100% occupancy, they're not because of what they charge. So, reading into occupancy has its challenges. And it's, that is whether you're extended stay or outside hallway hotel, inside hallway, full service, not, I mean, it runs the gamut. So, there is no question that hotels are being built up and down the interstate, but, not everybody is seeking that. And we've had the counterintuitive argument, well, I mean, it's not counterintuitive, but it's counter argument, which is I have kids, and kids don't do well in hotels unless they're suite style, and that's what a lot of young families have said is, I've got little kids and I don't want them running up and down, with people below me annoying them, and they get up early and they scream and whatever, and there's that whole argument. So you run into the gamut. By and large, in my role with commercial and economic development, I've not had direct complaints from the hotels about short-term rentals other than lodging taxes, which is different people like different things, and to Anna's point,
You said lodging taxes, meaning Megan, that people,
saying, hey,
they want it collected.
hey, you know, we pay them,
Fairness.
they should pay them. You know, that is the main argument that I've heard directly. Now, some of you may have been told other things.
Okay. Bob, do you have any questions? Marcus?
Yeah, actually I do. So just as a process, well, I guess probably before us. So if you want a short-term non-primary rental in that, the yellow, portion, that's conditional. So therefore, you go to the planning staff for a permit and then have to go through the entire process, right?
That's
So
correct.
it says in the ordinance, right, that it says you have to have permission of 50% of your abutting neighbors in order to do so. So how does that work? Do you have to come with, you have to go to your neighbors and ask them for consent, and then they have to draw something in writing, and then you take that to the planning?
We just have some type of form that they'd be able to use and go get those signatures, and we probably verify.
Okay. So it's something that the staff will give to you, and then you can go and get those.
And Marcus,
signatures.
you know this because you're on the planning commission, but I think it's good if Forrest goes over what abutting means, because it's more than people think it is.
Abutting is essentially touching the parcel, or if you're directly across the right of way from it.
So it does include across the
And would we be the ones to determine that? The planning staff or codes or somebody like that?
Planning does.
Would have to
Yeah,
make that determination?
you just look at our parcel map, and if you've got even a portion of your property that's directly across the right of way, you're obligated to be notified.
Okay. Sure, great question.
So, is it okay to mention some concerns with this yet, or are we still listening?
No, we're still listening.
Okay. But I guess that, some of the concerns that I read are the comments about creating some of these zones, then are we driving all of the short-term rentals into these areas and not expanding it to the whole city? So, like on this map, it has the little red dots, the red and the green dots that say owners are present or owners are absent. So there are a lot of red dots that the owner's absent, but that's where the homestay is allowed, but not a short-term rental. So that is not
60 days a year or
60 or 120. Really, the big difference is in how many days you can have it per year. Because the homestay was fairly restrictive, and like I said, we kind of opened it up so now it doesn't have to be owner occupied, for example, during those periods of rental activity.
in the city limits of Auburn, everybody at a minimum can do it for 60 days. And be not home.
and if they don't live there.
If they don't live there, then that's the other type of.
Well, the homestay presumes that you do live there and you're a primary resident there, but you don't have to be there during the 60 or 120 days that you're running.
But then, like where I'm seeing these red dots, that says the owner's absent. So does that mean that the owner's not there? So then they wouldn't qualify.
I think, yeah, now that's STR's map, those red dots were done by the short-term rental homeowners. So
Okay.
I would be somewhat speculating as to exactly what those different colors
To your
are.
question, if this passed as written, and those are owner occupied places and for 60 days a year, and a lot of the zones that are getting outside of this area, you would be okay at a minimum, and not be home. You can be wherever you want for 60 days a year and rent it out.
What other ordinances, what were your comparator cities? Like, do Do you remember which other places?
It was
you
probably a
went?
mixture of college communities and more tourist-oriented communities. Charleston was one. I spent, the ones I spent the most time with on the phone were Charlottesville, Virginia, simply because they're a little bit smaller than us, but you know, they've got a similar geographical configuration where they've got a loop road and a lot of older housing that's close into the campus, and the campuses. The boundaries of the campus aren't nearly as well defined as this. It kind of meanders, but that was a good community. I've got Jade's number on my stack.
I pulled Clemson's today, and they had one. that was-
Boulder, Austin, Texas, Fort Collins, Berkeley, California. There's Charlottesville, San Luis Obispo.
That's both beach and college town, I've got both.
San Jose, California. California just has a ton, Tuscaloosa, California just has a ton of short-term rental material, and the different mechanisms they employ and the wide array in which they regulate is pretty significant.
They're also a home rule state, which means cities can do whatever they want unless the state tells them they can't do it, which means they have tremendous flexibility within state law to make their own regulations, which gives you the gamut, depending on their city charters of how that works. So that gives them more flexibility under state law than we have, in essence. So it helps to know.
Now, our sister city, if you wanna call it that, Tuscaloosa, has an ordinance, and they limit the rentals to 30 days a year, maximum, 30 days a year. And they also have a provision that, you can't have more than 2, I think, per block on a street. So they have some more stringent requirements than we do here, which you may want to
I've
look into.
I've totally volunteered on many times. This most recent version is one of the most permissive ordinances I've seen.
It is.
This one, ours.
The
Yes.
current version, after being directed to make it more permissive, we went more permissive. So that's what you got.
And the discussion at the
But
national.
the survey results from the first survey don't suggest that. I've gone through them many times, and the survey results, I think we need to take a closer look at the survey results from the first edition. I don't think they actually come up to suggest that. I'm not sure how I can draw that conclusion,
Those
from
results for us, how can we provide that to the task
how we
force?
got to be more permissive from the survey.
Yeah, I don't have any access to it.
But wasn't the change or the result of the survey plus the lengthy public meeting
Right.
that
Yeah, I mean, I don't
you
think.
held, that a lot of that was from the public meeting, there was fewer comments then and a lot of public meeting also.
Yeah, and respectfully, I disagree, because I went through, because I listened to the tape, to the live streaming, and then I transcribed it, and I went through that, and then I also went through the survey, the first survey results, and I did not come to the same conclusion that people wanted a more permissive ordinance. So perhaps it'd be good if we all then went back and reviewed that survey and the transcription and taken a look at it, and I'll do the same.
Following on the conditional aspect of the overlay there, excuse my ignorance on this. A conditional permit would have some defined conditions, say like what we just briefly, somebody touched on, how many per block. Would the planning department go ahead and define the conditions in a clearly reasonable manner?
There's a couple of aspects to that. Things like, if you're gonna have distance requirement, I mean, what you don't wanna do is have conditions that are arbitrary. If you wanna have specific conditions like hours of operation, that's something you can talk about. But if you're talking about starting to limit these things geographically, I would just recommend that that be part of the ordinance. What the conditional use process does allow you to do is a number of things. Number one, neighbors get an opportunity to come before you and express their opinions. So you're gonna have people notified, a sign's gonna be posted, so the neighbor is gonna know about it. And you can look at that property kind of on its own. What are the unique conditions with that property as it relates to adjacent residences? Because every property is unique and different. And so it gives us an opportunity to kind of put these under the microscope when they're in locations where they may or may not be appropriate. And so that's what that process is all about, you know. For a number of different reasons, we may just say, we don't think this is compatible in this particular area. And we would explain why in the staff report, and then you would have that recommendation to consider and weigh in your deliberation.
I think if you choose to regulate per block, per census tract, what other cities have done, you'll have to then decide, how do you decide which 4 people out of the 25 that are applying? Meaning then you need to apply additional criteria, and that's where I go back to the more complicated it is, it becomes more work for you guys. Staff will do what we are asked to do through the process, but then it's also complicating planning commission and city council, and you may be up for the challenge, and that's fine, but those are things where some cities said when we started regulating this way, and I know Nashville did that initially also, which is we'll take per census tract, and it's whoever gets down here first with the right paperwork. Okay, well that, initially, you know, that's great, but it's then there is the other side of that is how are you choosing who and what areas that you decide get the licenses and why. The conditional use process, at least as written, does let you avail yourself of whatever unique circumstances on a parcel by parcel basis, avail themselves with neighbors and other things, but you know, that's up to you guys if you wanna regulate that way. Again, as Forrest said, staff, you know, Forrest wasn't trying to make this more permissive. He wrote a reasonably conservative ordinance. He was asked to adjust it to allow it to be more permissive based on previous feedback, so he did. And it can certainly go the other way with your direction and planning commission, and then back to the city council.
Okay, so we'll wrap up. It's an hour, so the public hearing is on the 22nd. It's at over at the Harris Center, and starts at 5:30. Okay, I would ask if all you guys could be there maybe at 5:20, and just so that you're there and settled and ready to go. And once again, I just ask you to be considerate of everybody and allow everybody to make their needs well known, and the time will come soon enough for all of you to state how you feel about all this. But right now, I just need you to listen. I think that's in the best interest of our city. Yes.
Sorry, Mayor, one of the things kind of ancillary to it was we had talked about the B7 general regulations regarding no more than 3 customers or clients of a home occupation business shall be present on the premises at the same time. I think we had
For home businesses.
Yeah, for home occupation businesses, that was kind of a broader category than just what we're looking at in the task force. I would recommend, we could talk about potentially kind of pulling this out of the ordinance, in city council or planning, or however the process is, as a separate issue, just because I know the subset of home occupations, the homestays are tuned in on the issue right now, they're listening, but I don't know that every home occupation, whether that's a photographer or someone else, or consulting firm, may be listening, and so I think it would be wise, to take that up as a separate issue.
Yeah, going out to follow up on what you said. Yeah, they're on the latest survey, or on the latest document, a number of people commented they got confused. Are you now trying to re-regulate the home occupation businesses? And so one of my recommendations would be to separate, like you were suggesting, pull out, leave the home business section alone, so that they don't get brought into it.
No, that's accurate. That was a change that I was recommending to kind of give some relative weight. When I started thinking about limitations on guests, again, you think about the idea of having an unlimited number of home occupations. No, that's totally legitimate. That can be stricken.
And I'm not discounting your report, I mean, I respect it. I think it's just a separate issue that we need to notice and bring up and have a public hearing on it.
Appreciate you.
Totally valid.
Okay. All right, thank all y'all for being here, and we'll see you in a second. Have a good return.
Thank you.
Can I hand out a couple more copies? Will you pass these around? Pass this around. Pass this around.
Just try to keep that around.
Well, thank you very much, I appreciate it. All right,
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Hey, Evan.
Yeah, that's it.
I called, reached out to the one guy, and I got the STR, the same employee. I guess it's